Selamat datang ke ASM Podcast yang dibawakan khas oleh Akademi Sains Malaysia. Siri podcast ini merupakan platform perkongsian topik-topik berkaitan sains, teknologi, inovasi dan ekonomi STIE secara santai dan mudah difahami. Setiap episod akan menampilkan jaringan pakar ASM yang akan berkongsi pengalaman dan pendapat mereka tentang STIE seiring dengan etos ASM. Budayakan sains, raikan teknologi, cetuskan inovasi.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Albert van Jaarsveld. I'm the Director General at IIASA, a research institution based just outside Vienna, in Austria. I'm delighted by this opportunity to talk to you and to share with you a little bit about the IIASA as an institution, and then also a little bit about the work that we do, and hopefully about what we can bring to the conversation of this very important forum in Malaysia. Just to get everybody up to speed, IIASA is an international research institute that conducts multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research to help policymakers find long-term solutions to global and universal challenges facing countries. In other words, those challenges that we all share across the globe. IIASA is a child of science diplomacy, born in 1972, and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And started off as an East-West institute, which gradually then developed into an institute that tackles shared global problems. We are a membership-driven organization. This is our current membership around the world, just for your interest and information. And we receive some of our funding from our member countries, and we also receive some of our funding, at least 50%, through international grants that we bring in as an institution. Conduct research on global change matters. Our institute houses about 350 researchers on average from 52 countries around the world. We are a multidisciplinary and international institution with about a third natural scientists and engineers, social scientists and mathematicians and computer scientists and others across the institution. We co-publish with more than 1,000 co-authors on an annual basis and engage with more than 700 research partners in member countries and elsewhere around the world. This is the kind of complex landscape that most policymakers are faced with when they have to make day-to-day decisions about interventions, policy changes that they would like to bring on board to hopefully improve the quality of life of people and the quality of the environment in which we function as a human species. And as you can see, it's an extremely complicated landscape, and this is what makes policy making so difficult and tough. And we at IIASA try our best to try and assist this process as it develops to ensure that we can make the best possible decisions against the background of this complexity, complex environments in which we function. So we at IIASA have developed over the last 50 years an entire set of what we call models, computer models that can be used for integrated assessment, that can be looking at a particular sector, but more importantly for IIASA is not only that our models can help us understand the energy sector or the forest sector or the water management sector better, but these models also engage with the population statistics of a particular part of the world, and it also can be related to the economy from that part of the world. So not only do our models speak to the population and the economy, but they also speak to each other. In other words, we can understand the trade-offs and synergies that emerge across this entire complex landscape better, and hopefully avoid some of the unintended consequences that can be precipitated by doing silo-specific analysis of our environment in support of sustainability. We at IIASA have demonstrated in a number of instances, the cost efficiency of these integrated policy approaches. This is just an example from the energy sector. If you looked at the left-hand side and you looked at the energy security alone, it would cost you at a global level about 0.2% of the GDP, global GDP, to resolve energy security matters. If you look only at air pollution, it will cost you about 0.5% of global GDP to resolve those. And for climate change itself, just over 0.8% of the global GDP. Whereas if you did them collectively at the same time, and you exploited the trade-offs and the synergies that are inherent in addressing each of these potential problems and look towards an integrated solution, you would save about 40% of the costs of implementing your policies at the end of the day and harness these synergies and trade-offs to make sure that we have better policy making across the board. IIASA has contributed to many high-impact policy contributions over the years. IIASA was central to Europe's success in reducing its air pollution, and a couple of key interventions that you see at the bottom there, the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution for Europe, the EU National Emissions Ceiling Directive, as well as the EU Clean Air Strategy done more recently. The population level, IIASA's population program has excelled in reaching particular benchmarks. IIASA population researchers were the first to point out that the doubling of the world population was going to be unlikely. They were the first to point out that the end of population growth is foreseeable, and we can predict that to some degree. And they were the first to point out that the acceleration of population aging is happening across the world. And this is something that we have to take seriously, but also the first to point out the power of education leading to lower population growth and higher economic growth around the world. IIASA researchers were also central to the research that was required to analyze the likelihood of the 1.5 degree Paris climate change agreement, and therefore was a driver for the international community to coalesce around this particular target for all our collective benefits. IIASA produces about 700 papers a year as an institution, and we're very proud of the fact that we try and place this research in the open access domain as far as we possibly can. We also produce papers in very high quality journals, last year up to 70 in the Nature family, Science, PNAS and Lancet family, to give you a sense of the quality of the research that's produced by IIASA. And we pride ourselves again that we maintain a profile in the best international scientific literature. We also have the people that can deliver on that research. Some 12 people in 2021 were on the Clarivate Analytics list in terms of the top 1% most cited researchers around the world in their particular disciplines. And we all even have one researcher that was actually recognized in 3 or more fields in this 2021 assessment. IIASA researchers and everybody at the institution play very high level policy guidance roles. In other words, they sit on advisory structures and bodies for many international and EU commissions to advise international bodies about science processes and giving advice about trying to tackle global change matters across the world. In 2020, IIASA launched its new strategy from 2021 onwards. It's summarized in the left-hand figure that you see in front of you. And that resulted in a restructuring of the institution into 6 broad programs to deliver on this research strategy. Advancing systems analysis, which is about the methods side of IIASA's work in developing new methods, biodiversity and natural resources, energy, climate and environment, population and just societies, economic frontiers, and strategic initiatives, which we use to engage with our member organizations in a very strategic and forward-looking manner. IIASA has conducted some very interesting work on the area of emerging threats, This is a water security assessment conducted using our community water model. It was looking at Asia as a whole in collaboration with Monash University, Malaysia in particular. And this research just emphasized the incredible risk of seasonal water scarcity across the whole Asian region. And that this water scarcity will become worse as climate change becomes worse. And therefore, this is a long-term threat that we all have to deal with. But more importantly also is that the lack of regional cooperation in terms of dealing with water security or water scarcity is going to become a serious problem for the Asian region as a whole. So it's really important that multilateral cooperation is part of the solution in terms of dealing with this emergent seasonal water scarcity, which is going to be a significant factor as climate change kicks in. Our researchers also looked for multiple benefits in terms, this is a particular biodiversity study, where they demonstrated that across the globe that by placing 30% of land in conservation strategically, we could not only safeguard 70% of all terrestrial plant and vertebrate animal species, but also conserve simultaneously more than 62% of the world's above and below ground vulnerable carbon and 68% of all the clean water. We also, under multiple benefits, this is a health example. In other words, by achieving the climate benefits agreed to by the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree Celsius target, there are multiple health benefits that flow from that, and especially if you combine that with clean air strategies. This is an indication of the thousands or millions of lives that can be saved by simply adhering to the 1.5 degree strategy together with clean air imperatives. And this gives you a sense that there's multiple benefits that flow from climate action and clean air action. And it's something that we should pursue and hopefully improve the lives of millions of people around the world. This particular example emphasizes trade-offs and risks. This particular study was done in the Indus Valley, where we looked at water, energy, and land use as a surrogate for food security across the basin. And this graphic just illustrates how the increasing climate or average temperature increases across the globe is going to increase the risks of us not achieving water, energy, or land food security, if you like, and that the compound security across the entire basin becomes worse as the climate temperatures increases significantly. So it's really important for us to act quickly and fast and not wait for the situation to become much more worse in all dimensions around a particular basin in this particular zone. Clean air is a really big issue in the Asian region, as you all know. This particular piece of IIASA research just demonstrates clearly how already implemented policy measures have significantly declined the exposure to pollution of many people around the Asian region. The particular Malaysian example indicates that there's been a significant reduction already below the WHO interim target 1 for 2005. There's been some recent legislation implemented in Malaysia that has further brought down the pollution exposure of the population, but there's also further potential to do even better and to drive the air pollution of most of the people in Malaysia to close to the 2005 WHO guideline. These are measures that we know we can do and it's actually implementable. These are not measures we're not quite sure how to tackle. So there is room for improvement in this space, and we would urge the Malaysian government to consider these kinds of interventions whenever feasible in the future. We also look at issues of intergenerational equity. What we do today is going to affect our children into the future. And this particular piece of work analyzed the consequences for newborns across the globe and illustrated how newborns will face 7 times more scorching heat waves during their lives than their grandparents. They will live through 2.6 times more droughts, 2.8 times as many river floods, and almost 3 times as many crop failures and twice the number of wildfires as people born 60 years ago, or people from my generation. So we're not doing very well in creating a future for our children, and we're not doing very well in creating a legacy that we can be proud of. So there's significant room for improvement to make sure that we provide an environment that will lead people to a viable future. Speaking about population and people, IIASA researchers have been working for a long time on projections of populations under different scenarios. This is 2 scenarios for Malaysia in particular for 2060. The first is what we call the sustainability scenario, and the second is the one we call stable development scenario. And the difference between the two essentially is the degree to which the population is going to be exposed to education at different levels, lower secondary, upper secondary, or post-secondary. And by increasing the exposure to education, the long-term population projections can be declined from 65 million under the stalled development scenario to close to 46 million people by 2060. This is a significant difference, and you can see the difference in the education profiles that emerge as a consequence of that investment. At the same time, you will also see an aging population emerging in this particular pyramid, which some people have suggested is a problem because you now have less people in the workforce and more people and an older population that have to be supported. But IIASA work has also demonstrated that this may not be as big a problem as people anticipate. We did a lot of work in China to demonstrate that low fertility is not necessarily linked to future prosperity. What's more important than the size of the workforce that you have in a particular part of the world is the skills base of that workforce. In other words, its quality. If its quality is good enough, it will not affect your economic competitiveness into the future. And therefore, the education focus may actually work to your benefit. Our population researchers have also demonstrated some different ways of looking towards measuring well-being towards sustainability. You all know the traditional statistic, which is life expectancy, which is, are you alive or are you dead? But within that period, there is something that the IIASA researchers call the years of good life. The years of good life is defined in terms of the capable longevity. In other words, are people out of poverty? Are they cognitively able? And can they actually, do they have no activity limitations in terms of their movement? So these are measurable and we can bring that into the equation, but we also have more subjective measures, if you like, in years of positive life satisfaction, which is more about happiness and so on. So by combining these kinds of information, we can come up with estimates of the years of good life. Now, this is an analysis across many countries. The details are not important. But essentially what it tells us is that for males across these countries, the years of good life range between 12 and 56 years for men over the age of 20. And that means that there's significant variances that are displayed across nations across the world. And therefore there's significant room for improvement for not only making sure that people survive, but they actually have a decent, productive life into the future. So dealing with uncertainty and catastrophe is something that every government has to tackle. We at IIASA have been spending a lot of time working in the risk space and how we deal with that. This is about disaster mitigation and development planning, and the CATSA model that we deploy to assess catastrophe simulations across the world has convinced so far 25 finance ministries from around the world to actually deal with risk of disasters very differently. What they've done is they've issued catastrophe bonds to move the risk of major earthquakes or hurricanes or other catastrophes out of the national fiscus and put it into the national reinsurance and capital markets. This way, the costs of dealing with these kinds of events does not fall on the national fiscus and allows countries to tap into the international markets to deal with these very rare but extreme events that can affect the finances of the environment severely. We also have the lessons from COVID-19, as all of you know. COVID-19 changed huge numbers of behaviors around the world in response to lockdowns and other activities that you are fully aware of. For us at IIASA, the challenge, of course, is how do we turn this crisis of COVID lockdowns into an opportunity? Are we going to allow societies to simply just return to their behaviors and activities prior to COVID? In other words, to restore the previous energy consumptions of the different sectors, for instance? Or are we going to inject some degree of self-reliance and some self-sufficiency into our populations and change some of the behaviors and the activities across the landscape to hopefully reduce our energy dependency? Are we going to become smart in the way that we now change our behaviors permanently into the future and significantly change behaviors and activities across a couple of sectors? Or are we even brave enough to go for the green push, where we have a combination of behavioral change together with support from national governments to ensure that we can fundamentally change the way that our energy sectors operate and function into the future, and can actually move towards a green push and actually make a significant step forward as far as our climate impact is concerned. So, in summary, this is the way that IIASA works when we engage with regions of the world in terms of decision making and considering the issues of uncertainty. We at IIASA have a group of well-established models that I've shared with you, some of them, that can be used to develop a comprehensive set of nexus indicators. In other words, these indicators that we develop are context-specific and developed, and then are benchmarked and measured against particular set goals in terms of performance. How well are we doing in terms of achieving those particular goals? We then inject considerations about the compound risks or degree of uncertainty in these measures and the goals that we are pursuing to develop spatially explicit analysis of those risks and sensitivities for those particular indicators. This work is always done in collaboration with our stakeholders and our communities. So we engage in a co-design process to explore different options and development pathways with these stakeholders, and to come up with outcomes that are hopefully realistic, that are policy possible and not necessarily just hypothetical, and that can possibly be considered for implementation. We've used this kind of approach in the world in 2050 in our work, and this is what we do when we engage with these kinds of difficult, complex matters. What we do is, in collaboration with our stakeholders and partners, develop a number of potential pathways that can be pursued to take us from where we are to where we want to be over time. We can do that through an intermediate goal, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, for argument's sake, in this particular example. But the idea is that these pathways can then be explored and considered by the policymakers and decision makers in terms of the values that underpin them, in terms of the priorities that people may want to set, and in terms of which pathways seem more viable from a political or socioeconomic perspective for a particular society. The bottom line is we give multiple options. Policymakers and decision makers choose from those options. And the importance of this kind of approach is that whatever they do, they're making informed choices. It's not based on a guess. This gives you a sense that there's a really high likelihood they can actually achieve those objectives if they follow the pathways that they've set up for themselves. We also implement monitoring systems to ensure that the pathways that we choose are effectively monitored and implemented. We ask the general population through our citizen science tools and our tool called Picture Pile to assess for us on an ongoing basis whether we're achieving the objectives that we set for ourselves. Feedback from the citizenry is a really important process because it also democratizes this entire process and makes sure that the population buys into what we're trying to achieve collectively, but also understand what is either going right or what is either going wrong in terms of the implementation of this policy over time. Monitoring, effective monitoring is really important to ensure that we achieve our objectives and goals in the long run. We at IIASA, of course, also have a long history of engagement with Malaysia, and if you so choose, we would be happy to continue this engagement and assist you in this very, very important process which you are now embarking on for the future of Malaysia. Thank you so much for listening to me.